The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting golden hues over the sprawling city park. Willow Haven, known for its serene walking paths and picturesque lake, was a sanctuary for many. Among its frequent visitors was Jack Rivers, a man of quiet strength and an aura that commanded respect. His towering frame and weathered face bore the marks of a life lived fully, trials, and battles fought both in and out of the ring. Jack sat on a wooden bench near the lake, eyes closed, listening to the rhythmic rustle of leaves in the breeze. Meditation was his escape, a way to reconnect with himself after years in the chaotic world of professional martial arts. Here, amidst the chirping of birds and laughter of children, he found solace. As he inhaled deeply, a commotion shattered the tranquility. Shouts echoed from a nearby bench. Jack's eyes snapped open, and his sharp gaze locked onto the source of the noise. An elderly woman sat hunched on a bench, clutching a worn leather purse. Her face, lined with years of wisdom and hardship, was pale and frightened. Two police officers loomed over her. Officer Nolan, a burly man with a permanent scowl, and Officer Grant, lean and sharp-featured, his tone dripping with impatience. "You need to come with us," Nolan barked. "I haven't done anything wrong," the woman protested, her voice trembling. "I'm just sitting here, minding my business." Jack's chest tightened as he watched Nolan grab the woman's arm roughly, causing her to flinch. Before she could stand, he yanked her forward, and she stumbled, her frail body collapsing onto the cobblestones. Gasps rippled through the park. A few people stopped to watch, some pulling out their phones to record, but no one stepped forward. Jack stood, his towering figure drawing immediate attention. His fists clenched at his sides, but his voice, when he spoke, was calm and steady. "Excuse me," he said, striding toward the scene. "What's going on here?" Nolan turned, his eyes narrowing as he sized up Jack. "Stay out of this. It's police business." Jack ignored the warning and knelt beside the elderly woman, gently helping her to her feet. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked softly. She nodded weakly, her hands shaking. "I don't know what they want. I didn't do anything wrong." "That's enough," Grant snapped. "Sir, step back or you'll be interfering with law enforcement." Jack rose to his full height, his gaze unwavering. "Interfering with what?" he said, his voice sharper now. "Throwing an innocent woman to the ground? That's not law enforcement. That's abuse." A murmur swept through the growing crowd. Nolan's jaw tightened, and he took a step toward Jack. "You don't know what you're talking about. Move along before you regret it." Jack's eyes, dark and unyielding, locked onto Nolan's. "No," he said firmly. "I won't." Nolan's frustration was evident in the red flush creeping up his neck. "You think you're tough?" he sneered, stepping closer to Jack. "I'm not here to fight," Jack replied, his voice calm but laced with steel. "I'm here to make sure you don't hurt anyone else." Grant, sensing the tension, put a hand on Nolan's shoulder. "Let's just get this over with," he muttered. But Nolan shrugged him off. The elderly woman, now steady on her feet, clutched Jack's arm. "Please," she whispered, "don't let them take me." Jack looked down at her, his heart aching at the fear in her eyes. "You're safe," he assured her. Then, turning back to the officers, he added, "You've made a mistake. Let her go. Back off." Nolan snapped. He reached for his radio, but before he could call for backup, a voice from the crowd rang out. "He's right. Let her go." The crowd, emboldened by Jack's stand, began to murmur in agreement. A young man with a phone stepped forward. "We got it all on video," he said. "You can't just do this." Nolan hesitated, his confidence wavering as the eyes of the crowd bore down on him. Grant, looking uneasy, whispered something to Nolan, but the senior officer ignored him. "All right, enough of this," Nolan said, pulling out his cuffs. "If you won't step aside, I'll take you in for obstruction." Jack smirked, his stance firm. "You can try," he said. The standoff was broken by the distant wail of a siren. A patrol car pulled up, and a woman in a crisp uniform stepped out. Her nameplate read Lieutenant Amanda Scott. She walked with purpose, her sharp eyes taking in the scene, the trembling elderly woman, the defiant crowd, and Jack standing like an immovable force. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the noise. Nolan turned to her, relief evident on his face. "Lieutenant, we were handling a situation when this guy decided to interfere." Jack interrupted, handling a situation by throwing an innocent woman to the ground. Scott raised a hand to silence them. "Enough," she said. She turned to the elderly woman. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Ms. Martin nodded hesitantly. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said. "They just grabbed me." Scott's gaze hardened as she turned to Nolan and Grant. "Did you have cause to detain her?" Nolan stammered. "We thought she matched the description of a suspect." Scott frowned. "Thought? Did you verify?" When neither officer answered, Scott's jaw tightened. "Release her. Now!" The tension in the air was palpable as Officer Nolan reluctantly unclipped the handcuffs from Ms. Martin's frail wrists. Her hands trembled, the red marks on her skin a stark reminder of the unnecessary force she had endured. The crowd erupted into murmurs, some muttering their approval at Lieutenant Scott's decision, others demanding harsher accountability for the officers. "About time," a young woman in a denim jacket muttered, her phone still trained on the scene. Jack stepped forward to steady Ms. Martin. "You're safe now," he said gently. His calming presence contrasted with the chaos swirling around them. Lieutenant Scott turned to Nolan and Grant. "Officers, follow protocol next time. We'll discuss your actions back at the precinct." "But, Lieutenant," Nolan began, his voice sharp with indignation. "Enough," Scott interrupted, her voice firm. "You've done enough damage here." The officers hesitated, their faces red with embarrassment, but they eventually retreated toward their car. Jack glanced at Ms. Martin, whose fear was slowly giving way to relief. "Let me take you somewhere safe," he said softly. "I just want to go home," she murmured. The crowd began to cheer, their voices unified in celebration of what they saw as a victory against injustice. "Thank you," someone shouted toward Jack. Another person added, "You're a real hero." Jack, however, wasn't interested in the accolades. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice loud enough to carry over the noise. "It's about standing up for what's right. And it's not over." By the time Jack helped Ms. Martin into a waiting car, the videos from the park were already making waves online. Clips of the confrontation, especially Jack standing his ground against the officers, were shared widely on social media platforms. Within hours, hashtags like #JusticeForEleanor and #StandWithJack were trending. At his small apartment later that evening, Jack received a call from an old friend, Lisa Carter, a local journalist. "Jack," Lisa's voice crackled over the line. "Do you realize what's happening?" "You can't guess," Jack said, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's all over the internet." "Isn't it?" "More than that," Lisa replied. "This is turning into a movement. People are calling for action against the officers. And you've become the face of it." "I didn't ask for that," Jack said, his voice quiet but firm. "I know," Lisa replied, "but people see you as someone who isn't afraid to stand up. This is bigger than you. Jack, you have a chance to make a difference." Jack sighed, staring out his window at the city lights. "I just want justice for her. Lisa, that's all." The following morning, news outlets picked up the story, replaying clips of Jack's confrontation with the officers and the emotional moments with Ms. Martin. Interviews with eyewitnesses painted a clear picture of police misconduct, further fueling public outrage. Lieutenant Scott held a press conference outside the precinct. Cameras flashed as reporters shouted questions, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony. "Lieutenant Scott," one reporter called out, "what actions are being taken against the officers involved?" Scott, composed but visibly strained, replied, "Officers Nolan and Grant have been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. We are committed to transparency and ensuring justice is served." Her words did little to calm the growing protests outside the station. People gathered with signs reading "Protect, Don't Abuse," and "Justice for Eleanor." Jack watched the coverage from his apartment, his jaw tightening as the faces of Nolan and Grant flashed on the screen. He knew their suspension was only a temporary measure. Jack visited Ms. Martin the next day at her modest home on the outskirts of the city. Her tiny garden was full of blooming flowers, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous day. She greeted him at the door, her face lighting up with gratitude. "Jack," she said, her voice warm but still tinged with exhaustion. "I didn't expect to see you again. I wanted to check on you," Jack said, stepping inside. The living room was filled with framed photos of her family and a well-worn armchair by the window. "I'm doing better, thanks to you," Ms. Martin said, pouring tea into 2 cups. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." Jack shook his head. "You shouldn't have needed someone to step in. What happened to you is wrong, and it happens to too many people who don't have someone to stand up for them." Ms. Martin's eyes softened. "You've lived a long life." "Jack, I've seen a lot of good and a lot of bad. But yesterday, you gave me hope. You showed me that there are still people willing to fight for what's right." Her words lingered with Jack long after he left. Over the next week, protests swelled in size. Community leaders and activists joined the movement, organizing marches and holding forums to discuss police reform. Jack was invited to speak at one such event, held in a local community center. He stood at the podium, his usually stoic face betraying a hint of nervousness. The room was packed with people eager to hear from the man who had become their symbol of hope. "I'm not a politician or an activist," Jack began, his voice steady but sincere. "I'm just someone who saw something wrong and couldn't walk away. What happened to Ms. Martin isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a larger problem. And if we want real change, we need to come together. Every one of us." Applause filled the room, and Jack continued, his words resonating deeply with the audience. Meanwhile, the investigation into Nolan and Grant intensified. An independent review board, under public pressure, began examining their past conduct. It was revealed that both officers had a history of complaints, many of which had been swept under the rug. Lieutenant Scott, determined to restore public trust, vowed to address systemic issues within the department. "This is not just about 2 officers," she said in a televised interview. "It's about ensuring accountability and rebuilding the relationship between the police and the community." The story culminates in a public hearing where Nolan and Grant are officially dismissed from the force, facing potential criminal charges. Reforms within the police department are announced, including mandatory training on ethics and de-escalation tactics, as well as the creation of an independent oversight committee. Jack, though reluctant to remain in the spotlight, continues to advocate for justice alongside Ms. Martin. Together, they become symbols of resilience and hope, proving that even in the face of injustice, unity and courage can pave the way for change. The hearing marked a significant turning point, but Jack Rivers and the community knew that systemic issues required sustained effort. The dismissal of officers Nolan and Grant sent shockwaves through the local police department, forcing many to confront a culture that had long allowed misconduct to go unchecked. In the aftermath, Jack became a reluctant leader of a growing movement. Community members, inspired by his courage, began organizing town hall meetings to discuss broader reforms. Jack often found himself at the center of these gatherings, speaking not as a polished activist, but as an ordinary citizen committed to fairness. "I'm not here because I have all the answers," Jack said during one meeting at Starlight Community Center. "I'm here because I know what it feels like to be powerless. Together, we can make sure no one else feels that way again." Beside him, Ms. Eleanor Martin shared her story. Her quiet, dignified presence lent a powerful voice to the cause. "This isn't about me alone," she said, gripping the microphone with trembling hands. "It's about all of us standing up when we see something wrong. And thanks to Jack, I found my strength." Her words brought tears to many eyes, solidifying the bond between the community and their new champions. As the movement gained momentum, so too did the opposition. A group of officers from the police union pushed back, claiming that Nolan and Grant were unfairly targeted. They framed the incident as a misunderstanding, arguing that public pressure had turned it into a spectacle. This backlash began to polarize the city. Supporters of the movement clashed with defenders of the status quo on social media and in public debates. Jack found himself at the center of the storm. One night, as he sat in his apartment scrolling through a barrage of online comments, he received a call from Lisa Carter. "Jack, you need to stay strong," Lisa said. "Not everyone will see the bigger picture. Change scares people, especially those who've benefited from the way things are." "I'm just tired," Jack admitted. "I never wanted to be a public figure. I just wanted to do the right thing." "And you did," Lisa said firmly. "You're giving people hope. Don't let the noise drown that out." Her words gave Jack the resolve to keep moving forward. Despite the challenges, the movement continued to grow. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when Lieutenant Amanda Scott invited Jack and Ms. Martin to participate in a community police dialogue. It was a risky move, but Scott believed it was the only way to rebuild trust. The meeting, held at the Willow Haven Town Hall, was tense at first. Officers sat on one side of the room, while community members filled the other. Jack stood at the podium, addressing the crowd with a calm but determined tone. "We're not here to tear anyone down," he began. "We're here to build something better. We want a police force we can trust, one that serves and protects everyone equally." A young officer raised his hand. "What about us? Not all of us are bad. It feels like we're being painted with the same brush." Jack nodded. "You're right. This isn't about blaming every officer. It's about holding those who abuse their power accountable. And it's about making sure good officers like you have the tools and support to do your job the right way." The room grew quieter as the dialogue continued, with both sides beginning to listen and understand each other. It was a small but meaningful step toward healing. Ms. Eleanor Martin, once a quiet and reserved woman, found herself becoming an unexpected figurehead for the movement. Her story resonated deeply with people, and she was invited to speak at schools, churches, and community centers. At one event, a young woman approached her with tears in her eyes. "Ms. Martin, my grandmother faced something similar years ago, but she never spoke up. Thank you for being brave." Eleanor smiled, her confidence growing with each encounter. "I wasn't always brave," she admitted, "but sometimes life gives you no choice but to stand tall." Her words inspired countless others, turning her into a beacon of hope. As public pressure mounted, local lawmakers began to take notice. A coalition of community leaders, activists, and reform-minded politicians drafted a comprehensive police accountability bill. The proposed legislation included measures for mandatory body cameras for all officers, de-escalation training, and cultural sensitivity workshops, independent review boards for complaints of misconduct. Jack and Ms. Martin were invited to testify before the city council. On the day of the hearing, the chamber was packed with supporters, their voices a powerful reminder of the community's resolve. Jack spoke with quiet authority. "This isn't about hating the police. It's about creating a system where everyone, officers and citizens alike, can feel safe and respected." Ms. Martin followed, her voice steady and clear. "I'm here because I don't want what happened to me to happen to anyone else. This is our chance to make things right." Their testimonies swayed undecided council members, and the bill passed with overwhelming support. The story of Willow Haven caught the attention of national media. Jack and Ms. Martin were invited to appear on a popular talk show, where they discussed the movement's impact and the challenges they faced. "We're just ordinary people," Jack said during the interview. "But when ordinary people come together, they can do extraordinary things." The interview sparked a wave of similar movements across the country, with communities organizing to address issues of police accountability and systemic injustice. Though progress had been made, Jack knew the fight was far from over. He continued working with Lieutenant Scott and other reform advocates to ensure the changes were implemented effectively. Ms. Martin, meanwhile, became a mentor to young activists, sharing her wisdom and encouraging them to carry the torch. One evening, as Jack walked through the park where it all began, he paused by the bench where Ms. Martin had been sitting that fateful day. The memory of the confrontation was still vivid. but now it felt like a distant echo. "We've come a long way," he murmured to himself. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "And we've still got a long way to go." Jack turned to see Ms. Martin. Her face lit with a warm smile. "Together," he said. "Always," she replied. Years later, Willow Haven was a different place. The police department, now a model of accountability and community engagement, was frequently cited as an example of successful reform. Jack and Ms. Martin's story became a symbol of hope, inspiring countless others to stand up for what's right. As Jack reflected on the journey, he knew the real victory wasn't in the policies or the accolades. It was in the people who had found their voices and the courage to use them. Justice, he realized, wasn't a destination. It was a journey, and it was one worth taking, no matter how long the road.